Hello, and welcome back to the H-Band Podcast, your go-to podcast for longevity policy discussions. I'm your host, Dylan Livingston. Today's guest is Martin Borch Jensen, co-founder and CSO of Gordian Biotechnology, a leading expert in the field of aging and longevity biotech, and a member of A4LI's Scientific Advisory Board. In this episode, we'll be discussing how Martin got involved in the longevity movement, as well as his latest research and insights on expanding healthy human lifespan. So sit back, relax, and join us as we delve into the world of longevity with one of the industry's brightest minds. Without further ado, here's Martin Borch Jensen.
Live long and prosper.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another installation of A4LI's Policy Discussion Podcast. My name is Dylan Livingston. I'm the host here, and I'm the founder and president of A4LI. And today, our guest will be Martin Borch Jensen, who is the CSO of Gordian Biotech. So, Martin, can you please say hi to everybody?
Sure. Hello, people interested in more efficiently improving human health.
Yes, well, I think everybody is more interested in improving human health, right? But I think our kind of vision here, or at least your vision, the longevity vision, is one of the ways to go, right? So
if you want to do it efficiently as opposed to inefficiently.
Exactly, agreed. So I usually start these podcasts off, Martin, by just trying to understand how you got in this field. So tell me, what was your moment? Because I had a moment that I realized, this is what I wanted to spend, hopefully not my whole life doing, right? Hopefully we get this figured out before my life is over. But, this is, there was a moment for me where I realized this is what I wanted to commit my life to. So what was your moment? And then who were your inspirations? When did you come to the realization that, you wanted to do what you're doing right now?
Right now in the specific sense, just maybe 4 years ago, but as you were saying, focusing on like improving human health through the biology of aging, that was as a teenager, maybe like 15, 16, I don't remember the exact year, but in high school. And before that, I was going to be a lawyer because that seemed like, probably for no particularly good reason other than like that seemed high prestige and like I liked arguing.
The world doesn't need any more lawyers, though. I'll tell you that.
So, but then, just contemplating life as teenagers are wont to do, I think there was a realization that, and then everything you do, regardless of what you do, like regardless of what you accomplish in your other career, then you're going to get old. Like first your parents are going to die and then they will never exist again. And then that's going to happen to you, et cetera, et cetera. And then from reading various books about science and I guess futurism, transhumanism, biology, but also other areas of science, just sort of getting the idea into your head that humankind can sort of solve problems through the application of our brains and a bunch of effort, right? And then deciding, okay, well, seems like I have an urgent problem right now that everyone's going to die. I didn't finish figuring out the meaning of life, but maybe if we solve everyone's going to die first, we'll have more time to think about that afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to, obviously, because, for me, I don't want, nobody wants to get sick and die, right? I mean, obviously, but I personally want to live long enough to see the future kind of play out, to see if we can kind of figure out some of those harder questions, right? So I'm with you. Maybe if we live long enough, we'll actually, what is it in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? It was like 37 or something, 41.
42.
42. Right,
but we don't know what the question is. Yeah, nobody wants to get sick, right? But we have our spider sense usually doesn't go off until after we're sick, right? So this idea that you're guaranteed to get sick because of aging is not something that we mostly feel in our daily lives. And I think that probably makes sense as long as there's like nothing you can do about it. You don't want to be anxious about everything bad that could happen. And so now we are, and I mean, this is what I'm about to say is probably something that's been said for thousands of years, and we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong again, but we really are in the first time in history where there is like experimental, validated, repeatable data that in other animals you can make changes through either genetics or sort of pharmacological interventions that change apparently the rate of aging as defined as, how long are you healthy, right? How long are you alive and healthy for, right? So that's only, depends on which experiments you count as the beginning, but sometime in like the late 80s, probably, that we started generating data that this was even possible. Didn't pick up steam immediately, and then, took some decades. So at least something has changed, which is that before there were claims, and now there are claims and data. I wouldn't say that there's understanding yet. I wouldn't say that we understand how human aging works and we know exactly what to do, but something historically is different.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and maybe to someone like me who's more of a layman and hopefully a consumer of these drugs and therapeutics, longevity drugs and therapeutics, I care less about personally with the why, but you as the scientist probably care a lot more. But I do agree, we are kind of on this precipice that we've never seen before of extending healthy human lifespan, and one of the issues that we kind of deal with, or that I think of at least, is the translatability between like you said, we have all these different drugs and therapeutics that work in mice and rodents, right? But like how transmissible are they to humans? And there are some that are, right, some that aren't. But I think this is kind of why and I think you probably too, with Norn Group, right, and trying to raise money for more shots on goal, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to do here with the government. We can raise more money, so we have more shots on goal, so more things work. But we also can spend money trying to actually understand why they work, right? So I'm, but just for the record, I'm sure you care more about the understanding. I just care about the results over here, So yeah,
I care about the results as well, to be honest. I mean, so now I'm no longer. Before I was in academia and doing the academic research, publishing papers, and all of this stuff. And one of the reasons I left was that I realized that I did actually care more about the concrete outcomes rather than the knowledge generation for its own sake, which I think is tremendously important. It's just, for me personally, it's less strong of a motivating factor than the outcomes. But as you mentioned with Norn Group, try to support that happening, because otherwise, I don't think we have the full answer yet. So if we stop doing curiosity-driven research, then I don't think we're going to get there.
Absolutely.
It's not all about starting a bunch of companies.
Right. There has to be a healthy mix of both, which is why you're such a fascinating guest to bring on, because you really do have your hand in everything, company building, trying to support the academic side, all that kind of stuff. So that's great. So let's move on to our next kind of question here, though. So let's talk about what you're up to at the moment. What are you doing to change the world, Martin? What's up? Let's talk about what you're up to. And then also, why is it going to change the world? And by the way, I know you're involved with a lot of different groups. So, feel free to be restrictive on some things if you need to be, but I'm happy, and I'm sure our audience is happy to hear as much as you can tell us.
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned, I have different hats that I'm wearing, maybe two main classes of hat. One is that I'm CSO of Gordian Biotechnology. As you mentioned, that is the dominant hat. And then there's another hat where I'm president of a nonprofit called Norn Group that has various 3.5 maybe programs currently that are aimed at accelerating the development of therapies based on aging biology. But most of the time does go into the for-profit Gordian. And very briefly, Gordian has invented technology that allows us to put many different potential therapies. So we're a drug discovery and drug development company trying to find new treatments so that people that currently are just going to stay sick get to be treated, right? Like that's kind of it's weird that you have to say this, but I feel like maybe in the current environment, it is actually important to say that, like, the fact that you can go to the doctor and that he or she can do anything is not a given, right? Like that comes from hundreds of years of trying to find out, we have a human in this state. We'd like them to not be in this state. Is there something that will fix that, right? And so, there's a lot of drug pricing and conversations. There's certainly, bad things going on, but it's important to remember at the same time that like, if there was no drug development, then nobody would like, there would be no point in going to the doctor. There would be no hospitals. And I know some people are going to disagree about like natural supplements and so forth. So anyway, getting back to the point.
I'm with you there, Martin. I agree with you. But we can have a conversation with those other people another day, but I'm with you.
So yeah, back to the point of we're trying to find drugs for diseases where currently there are no treatments, diseases of aging like heart failure or osteoarthritis. Mm-hmm. And the central sort of idea of the company is that these diseases of aging currently are mainly being studied in animal models and cell culture models, mm-hmm. where aging is completely absent. So basically you want to know whether this thing is going to take this old person with osteoarthritis and fix their joints so that they're no longer in pain and immobile. And since we don't just like randomly put drugs into humans and see if they work, the standard way that you do this discovery is you have some ideas and then you test those ideas in an animal model. Usually that animal model is a mouse. Mm-hmm. And usually that mouse is a young mouse where you've somehow like injured the mouse in order mm-hmm. to create a model for the disease, and then you mm-hmm. test whether your drug works. And as you mentioned, there are things that have succeeded in mice that do not succeed in patients. And the thesis at Gordian is that, well, especially for these diseases that practically only happen in old people, the incidence goes up 1,000-fold or more with age. Mm-hmm. You're going in and creating models of these diseases that do not have any of the changes that happen with age, and which in humans apparently are required before you manifest the disease. Mm-hmm. Those are not included in the models. And we also haven't found drugs that work generally. And so the thesis is that, well, if we bring aging into the drug discovery for diseases of aging, maybe we would find therapies that work mm-hmm. more efficiently. And so now the problem is, you can say that, and you could say, oh, you should, instead of using a mouse model where there's some injury and then that damages the joint, and then you call that osteoarthritis model, maybe you should just wait for 2 years for a bunch of your mice to get old and then see which ones spontaneously get osteoarthritis, and then that should be your model.
Right. Agreed.
That's probably a better model, but nobody wants to wait 2 years.
Right.
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 And then maybe somebody has an old mouse with osteoarthritis somewhere, and you could, do your study there, but, they don't have hundreds of animals. So you can't really test a lot of potential treatments in that regime.
Right.
And so what Gordian does, we've invented technology that lets us put hundreds of potential therapies into a single animal and test them all sort of independently, simultaneously inside of the diseased organ of the animal. And I think for this show, I won't get into like what are the technical, gene therapy, et cetera, things that allow us to do that. But if you just, for now, unless you want to follow up on it, assume that's a true statement. We can put hundreds of things simultaneously into a single animal and see what each one did and whether it was beneficial for a disease.
Well, no.
You're questioning it a little bit.
No. I'm not questioning it at all. So what I was going to say is, this audience definitely is not the most scientifically minded, right? We're, a political organization doing political advocacy or, stuff. But, maybe if you wanted to, if you had like a 1 minute version, if you wanted to go a little deeper. Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'm sure everybody would appreciate that.
Right. So the reason we can do this is because of biotechnological advancements that have been made thanks to like a bunch of other people. There's two or three core things at play here. One is gene therapy. The other one is something called single cell sequencing that I'll talk about. And then the third one is just computational, bioinformatics, how we can analyze large biological data sets. Mm-hmm. All these three have been on a dramatic sort of like increase in capabilities over the past maybe decade or so. And the timing is now such that we can, at Gordian, build on all of these advances. So let's start with gene therapy. There's a lot of things called gene therapy. let's just define it as the ability to deliver DNA sequences to cells, to individual cells in the body, and then have those DNA sequences express some gene or knock down or remove the activity of some gene. And so the key difference is that instead of putting a chemical structure into the body with a pill and it goes everywhere, you can deliver in a targeted way a DNA structure that also does similar things, turns things up and down. And the important thing for us is that you can deliver it to specific cells. And so what we do is we take the diseased organ and we put in a low dose of these therapies so that a few cells scattered throughout the organ receive some therapy, but most of the cells do not. And the cells that do receive a therapy get exactly one therapy. So although you've put hundreds of different therapies into the animal, their effects are separated out into individual cells in the animal, and the environment of those cells is still the sort of heart failure or whatever the disease condition is. And so you're studying whether this treatment works with the full complexity of the disease present. But you can do that at very high scale.
So Martin, I've known about Gordian for quite some time now, and we've had conversations, but I think this is the first time that I've actually been, like my mouth has dropped at how potentially groundbreaking what you're doing is. That's great. That's shocking. And so let me just follow up on that real quick. So are you guys also at the same time, you're developing it's in vivo, right? An in vivo drug delivery system, right? Right. Correct me if I'm wrong with the lingo here. What's the right terminology here? What's the right terminology?
Can you repeat that?
So what is this all called? It's in vivo testing in animals, right? That's what this is referred to as in the scientific community.
Yeah,
right?
I think I would call it in vivo. So in vivo means in the living organism, right? So inside of an animal. And then pooled screening is usually when you take many things and mix them together and test them all simultaneously. So in vivo pooled screening is what I would call it.
Okay, in vivo pooled screening. Gotcha. So, but let me ask you one more question about Gordian specifically, though. So, while you're doing all of this, are you also looking to create a drug based, how most longevity biotechs create a senolytic or a this, that, or the other thing? Are you guys creating, a pipeline at the same time?
We are creating a pipeline by doing these screens. And so rather than saying, we think that senolytics is the best idea, as opposed to like inhibiting this mTOR pathway is the best idea, as opposed to et cetera, right? So instead of starting with like, this is the best biology, let us go and find what usually happens for these companies is like they find a way to drug that biology, and then they go and find which diseases will this actually cure, because we have some data that it's beneficial for healthy lifespan, but we don't know which disease it'll go after. So what we do instead is say, let's not have a prior on what is the best way to reverse a specific age-related disease. Let's test, hundreds or thousands of things, but let's do it in the environment where we actually want the answer, which is, all the physiological decline associated with age is present. And so we're asking for, okay, this is what we need a fix for, and model that very, very closely, and then just try everything and see. And, maybe we'll come up, I wouldn't be surprised, we come up with like pathways that are also known from academic research into aging biology or into the disease biology. Maybe we'll find different targets within those pathways. But the point, the name of the company, Gordian, there's a whole legend with the Gordian knot, right? But it's the short story of the legend is that it's about looking at an impossible problem and then solving it in a different way. So rather than untying the knot that's so complex that nobody can untie it, in the legend, Alexander the Great decides to cut it with his sword and therefore open it, right? So I spent, close to a decade in academia studying aging biology. And you could, propose the idea that like, oh, we'll study it and we'll understand it and then we'll know what to do and then we'll do that. And this is kind of like, in a sense, it's capitulation on that dream. It's like, man, it's going to take decades to understand everything. Is there a way that we can get the answers that we want without having to have perfect understanding?
Sure.
And that way is find the environment where you need your answers and then find a way to run many, many, many tests simultaneously.
You guys over at Gordian, you guys are some smart people. I'll tell you that. You talk about thinking outside of the box. You guys are thinking outside of the knot over there. I mean, that is It's quite impressive.
We're trying to set everything up so that we can be stupid and still have it work. That's basically right. Like no, nothing, but you still get the right answer.
Well, so let me follow up. So you have seen, so how many, different, I would say, drugs have you put through this, in vivo system? How many drugs have you tested at this point?
At this point, we've tested a few hundred drugs. Right now, we're in the middle of scaling up. So, when we started 4 years ago, like in vivo therapeutic screening as a pool was not a thing. Like that was not
right.
And as probably with any startup, we go and present the idea and then see people are like, that won't work because, you need multiple AAV genome per cell, otherwise they won't express, or some other like theoretical biological reason. But biology, the reason we don't have laws in biology is because most things are unknown and like rules often only apply within a certain context. And so
right.
So then we had to just try it and see if we could make it work. The answer is yes. And then now we've been growing the team up, like a year ago, we were 8 people and now we're 24, I think, and expanding to go into the best animal models for each of these diseases, which may not even be a mouse. And so a lot of what we do, in a sense, what we do is we do the same thing that other people do, which is eventually they get to an in vivo test for whether it works or not. We just do that directly and high throughput. But there's another sense in which we're able, thanks to this advantage, we're able to go into animal models that much better represent the patients and that nobody else could realistically use. So like for osteoarthritis, we're actually not using mice, we're using horses because the joint of a horse is much more similar to a human horse. And so we can go out and find an old horse that has developed osteoarthritis naturally by like living and then run experiments in that model rather than in, like a mouse model. Everyone else uses mice because they have to. So
that's fascinating. So let me ask, why are there, I'm sure that maybe I just don't know, but why not do something like as, genetically similar to humans as possible, like primates or, like a monkey, apes, things like that? Or,
genetics is one important thing, but once you go out and look at sort of comparative genomics, but also comparative physiology, it turns out that there are a lot of different factors. For example, if we use the example of osteoarthritis, many primates don't walk upright on their legs the way that humans do. And so actually the load bearing sort of structure of the cartilage is not subjected to sort of similar strains as humans if you have a tree-dwelling primate. And so the genetics may be more similar, but the anatomy is different and there's no spontaneous formation of this disease.
Gotcha.
Necessarily. There are some, like I think chimps do get OA. But yeah, so there's a whole lot of factors and it's an interesting area to move into because like everyone wants better models for disease. And what better means here is like more likely to predict what's actually going to happen in your clinical trial at the end, right? With real patients. But most companies, and including big pharma companies, have these constraints of like, but we got to be able to get like 10,000 of them and house them in our vivarium. And so what is the best model? Once you have no or very few constraints, actually becomes a very sort of interesting question that generally speaking, nobody in the world has an answer to because we don't know exactly how these diseases work. So, if for a genetic model, where you know exactly how it works, you might have a better sense of that. I don't know if this is probably getting too far into the weeds of the challenges that we're facing, but the core of it is like you want to cure a patient. And before you go into the patient, you're going to run some tests. And can you find a way where the tests that you run before you go into the patient very, very closely resembles what's going on in the patient without having to spend all of your resources on testing just a single hypothesis around what might benefit the patient, right? That's kind of what we're trying to, have our cake and eat it too.
Absolutely. So let me just ask you, before I get into this next part of the conversation, I just want to ask you real quick, what do you think about things like organ on a chip technology? I've seen a few kind of companies, that are longevity adjacent start up in the last few years. And there's a few longevity organizations that are starting to do organ on a chip as a longevity initiative. What are you just briefly, I know maybe you're not an expert, maybe you are, I don't know, but Do you see the whole organ on a chip movement as being, kind of a way to get more precise medicine faster?
Yes, but not for aging.
Okay.
I am not an expert, but I am somewhat familiar because these are clearly models that we are considering. In fact, I think the first version of Gordian was based on organ on a chip. The first idea version before we sort of really got started was based on organ on a chip. The problem is that, let's say start with the advantages, right? You're using human cells. You can potentially, and so organ on a chip is like a small microfluidic system where you populate some sort of scaffold with cells from a human, and they can be from an actual patient with a disease. And then you have some like the usual cell culture media and stuff flowing over them. And sometimes you have biomechanical forces there as well. So like lung on a chip, you might have a layer of cells, and then you have some membrane, and you can blow some air in and like stretch the cells, which tries to replicate what happens in vivo. So one advantage is that you have human genetics, and even if you find an animal model that closely resembles humans, it is not exactly the same, and those differences might matter in ways that you can't predict. The other thing is that animals are large, especially large animals are large, and so the logistics of doing experiments are much more challenging compared to the sort of microfluidic systems. And then there's the ethical aspects as well. The problem for organ on a chip is that, so let's start with an assumption. We don't know how aging works. So this is my take after, more than a decade of doing this. If someone disagrees with that, then that's what we should be discussing. But if we don't know how aging works, then it is difficult to create a model that fully encapsulates it. So if aging in part includes your immune system undergoing changes and therefore being less likely to clear senescent cells from your liver, and therefore your liver has a different secretion profile that changes which hormones your pancreas is exposed to, and therefore that changes your like insulin sensitivity, and therefore that changes like your immune system and so forth. Like there's all these connections, which usually when we look for those connections, we find them. So probably, there are a bunch of connections between not only different biological pathways, but also different organs and different types of cells. And you see that many of the diseases of aging also clearly involve some sort of interplay between different types of cells, like inflammation coming from the immune system, triggering death in neurons and so forth. So if all that stuff matters, you do an organ on a chip, you have one organ, and you don't even have an organ. Most of the time you have one or two cell types from that organ, but not all the other ones. And you don't have an immune system. And the cells that you populate with, in many cases, they're not old. So when you use induced pluripotent stem cells as the sort of seeding mechanism, which are seeing a big boom in sort of drug discovery, the cells came from stem cells. They're basically embryos, right? Like they correspond to a liver or lung or whatever that isn't even born yet in terms of their sort of gene expression and so forth. And in other cases, people don't use those. They do isolate cells directly from patients. When they do that, usually they don't use old patients because cells don't survive as well and they kind of suck and everything, harder to work with. And if you do use cells from old patients, the cells that do survive are probably an enriched set. Maybe they're the healthier cells from that organ. So there's all these sort of aspects of the biology of aging that you aren't capturing in those models. And therefore, you may find that whatever it is you're testing works the same in these conditions as in an aged human. But if aging is, like if the changes with age that happen are a reason why the disease manifests and you're not capturing those changes, it may not work the same, right? It may be that you find a really good dial to turn, except the whole problem is that with aging, that dial gunks up and no longer works. So I think it's an interesting thing. I think it's a more suitable system for testing, for example, developmental diseases and genetic disorders and stuff like that. Of course, I have a bias here, but it is something we have strongly considered, and I am very excited for someone to develop an organ on a chip model that incorporates connections between organs as well as biology of aging.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the only reason I ask is I've seen, one of our sponsors, Methuselah Foundation, actually is working on something like that. not really looking to create the technology per se, but trying to create a roadmap so we can get to some sort of personalized medicine using organ on a chip. So that's the only reason I ask. I find it interesting, and plus also, I like animals. I don't want to, test too many more drugs on these animals, right? They should just be allowed to just live. But that's a conversation for a PETA podcast, not for a longevity podcast. But yeah, so that's great. You definitely just taught our audience a good amount. So now, though, I want to just kind of move into the political kind of space where you might not be as comfortable, but I'm a little more comfortable here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some politics, namely geopolitics. So you've started under, I believe, the Norn Group umbrella, right? You started the Longevity Talent Bridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I find that absolutely fascinating as a geopolitical tool because, the idea of brain drain is real, right? And, there's been plenty of examples of, brain drain hurting one country and helping another. I mean, you can go back to World War II or end of the Cold War, right? I mean, there's plenty of examples right now what's going on in Russia, right? Brain drain is real and hurts the country that it is where the brains are being drained from. But it helps the countries that are getting, an influx of brains, right? So it seems to me that the Longevity Talent Bridge is kind of a way to, obviously not encourage other countries to lose their best and brightest, but encourage, the best and brightest from other countries to come to America so that they can fulfill their potential and dreams. That's what it seems to me to be. So, am I right on that assumption? And, can you just talk a little bit more about the Longevity Talent Bridge program, because I find it absolutely fascinating and something that, A4LI should be, pushing for at higher levels as well. So can you just kind of talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the core of the program is basically, and I think, maybe I have a naive worldview as not politically engaged, but to me, it seems like, there are different countries in the world. They have different geographies, but they also have different cultures and different values.
Mm.
And you're born somewhere, which is kind of a lottery. And then sometimes you find, you know what, I'm more aligned with this other place over here. That's true for me. I was born in Denmark and I felt more at home in California after I sort of by chance ended up moving here. And in my naive worldview, like that should be allowed and encouraged, right? Like if you want to support a certain way of like structuring society and all this kind of stuff, then you should be invited in. Now, different countries have different degrees of sort of inviting people in. The US has clearly benefited greatly from inviting people in. Over the decades. I mean, the whole country, well, okay. If we go back too far to the original sort of like European migration to the US, you can argue about who benefited and who did not benefit. But if we just keep it to like, let's say the last 100 years, many of the great, if you look at whatever you want to like measure, Olympic medals, Nobel Prizes, billion-dollar companies, etc. Immigrants are often first or second degree immigrants are often overrepresented. Yep. And so So the idea behind Talent Bridge was basically like having worked with people who came from other countries to the US and sometimes just being absolutely amazing, right? Like really motivated, really smart, and clearly capable of accomplishing great things. And often, they're whether or not, or at least the speed at which they do accomplish those things are very much affected by like, does someone talk to them and give them a chance? Because if they just, they're sitting in Russia or Ukraine or Turkey or whatever and sending resumes to the US, now assuming that they want to be in the US, that doesn't have to be true. It's hard. Like you go to the best university in, Turkey, people in the US don't know the difference. Right. So they're like, they can't tell that you're awesome. They don't know all the prizes you got, all this kind of stuff, right? And, the university that you went to probably didn't have a lot of money for like gene therapy and single cell sequencing. So there are some skills that you wouldn't have developed and all this kind of stuff. Right. So how do we try to identify those people who are able to have a huge impact? In this case, towards longevity, because that's all I care about, what I care most about anyway, and help them reach the US. And so the program Talent Bridge is, as the name suggests, trying to create a bridge whereby those individuals can get exposed to academic research labs and companies, biotech companies, and other things in the US where their talents would be greatly utilized, and eventually, like they may immigrate to the US. But for starters, just like get them here and get them contributing to the important problems that exist in the US. And like it's too bad that that someone needs to create an initiative for this, because compared to other countries, the US used to be very open. At least if you're, whether it's like a geological alignment or, you have some sort of advanced degree or whatever. But now, there's all these different examples of like year or multi-year wait times to like get to a US embassy if you're in India and other countries. So yeah, that's one of the programs at Norn, and it's run by this guy Amos, who is an American, but actually is in Taipei, and supported by a bunch of generous donors who kind of share an excitement about, high skill immigration and or longevity.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Amos is a good guy. I've spoken to him a few times about this actually, and this is why I find it so interesting, because this is it really is kind of a political longevity initiative, right? And and not only in that. It's a political longevity initiative for the U.S. to try to bolster the U.S.'s longevity biotech economy, right? But we also, in reality, a lot of the best institutions, a lot of the best, research facilities are here in the U.S., right? So, if we want to kind of be able to pair up the right people with the right equipment and things like that, it just so happens that, they're going to be in the U.S. But my question also is, I mean, you're from Copenhagen, or not Copenhagen, Denmark. I was just in Copenhagen. Both. You're from Copenhagen. There you go. Beautiful city, by the way. Just there for the ARDD conference in August. Loved it. And then I was also in Dublin recently, right? And so for the other Longevity Summit Dublin conference, and then there's the Longevity Investors Conference in Switzerland, I believe, and there's this one and that one. So it seems like there's like a lot of activity in Europe as well. It's not just the U.S. Is there any sort of, longevity talent bridge for Europe, or is it just the US? And, if there's nothing for Europe, or I'm extending this to maybe even Canada, something like that. Why not? Why not those other countries? Is it too big, too much is the bandwidth too large? Is it, what's the reason, if I might ask? For
us or in general?
Both, I guess. For you guys, I guess.
For us, because we are a US nonprofit. And so and then no particular reason. Like if someone wants to clone it for Canada or whatever, they're more than welcome. In general, I don't know. I don't know why this wasn't a thing. I mean, this program only started in April of this year. So, and we're just like building up steam. Basically, one of the big challenges for the program is to find people, because the people who do reach the US, who want to come here and then do reach the US, are generally the people who are either A, well connected here, or B, who look more obviously awesome, on their resume for whatever reason. And so those people are going to get here anyway. So we don't need to help those people. So who we need to help is people who on paper are not obviously should get here. And this applies for things like visas as well, right? Like if you're applying for an O1 visa, you got to have certain things on your resume showing that you're outstanding. And you could be outstanding and not have those things on your resume because the way you applied your abilities just isn't a thing that gets captured on paper, or whatever that means. And so we have to find the people who are not on paper awesome, but are awesome. So how do you actually do that? There's a
what do you guys have,
search project.
Yeah,
So exactly, what Amos has been doing is building up a network of scouts at universities and just other good individuals and so forth all over the world in order to identify people. And so building up the network of scouts and then finding people that match the needs of potential future hosts in America. That's kind of what we're putting together. But, It could fail. I don't pretend. There's a bunch of experiments happening. Both Gordian is an experiment. I'm saying that in vivo is important for aging, and at Norton Group there are different experiments happening, and I don't expect that all of them are gonna like perfectly work out. But it's better to do something and get started than to like not do something, right? And I think so far the track record is reasonably good. The experiments at Norton that have already happened and where there's a little bit more data on how it went, including the apprenticeship and the impetus grants, so far it looks good. So fingers crossed for Talent Bridge as well. And kind of an implicit goal of starting it was to have other people clone it in different areas of expertise. Like somebody should make an AI one. It's not us because our nonprofit is focused on longevity, but yeah, somebody should just clone it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Well, hopefully we have some AI people listening into this podcast and they can clone it. I agree. And, like for just as a little side note, I've been working with a group in Canada called the Canadian Longevity Association, who, kind of saw what I was doing with A4LI and got inspired to kind of do something over in Canada as well. And I was inspired, right, in the U.S. here by those UK all-party parliamentary group people, right? So, like, you doing this definitely will, inspire others to kind of clone it because it's a good idea, and good ideas are often copied. So, kudos to you, and we'll make sure to give you all the credit for the good idea if you want, but if not, it's all right too. But all right, Martin, so we're at the last kind of part of our discussion right now. So I just wanted to do one last thing with you before we hop off here. Okay. I like to end the interviews, the podcast with a note of optimism, right? I like to make the audience know that everything's going to be okay. That's what I believe in. Everything's going to be okay. So, can you give your view? Can you give our listeners some hope? Why should we be optimistic for the world in, 10, 20 years? What do you see as being the most promising things on the horizon? What's your outlook on humanity? I'm guessing it's optimistic, but maybe it's not. But what's your outlook on humanity?
Yeah, maybe a tad, of stoicism thrown in, but ultimately, I think the reason to be optimistic is that the problems we face are ones that we can choose to do something about or not. And so because we have agency, we should be optimistic and we should utilize our agency to do things. So whether or not we're going to treat diseases depends on whether people allocate their brains and efforts and funds and so forth to find drugs. Like we have eliminated many diseases and we've made many incurable diseases very much curable, treatable, etc. Right? And along every other aspect of humanity as well. Like it's kind of up to us to decide, here's a tyrant. Do we stand up to that? Here's a person who needs help. Like, do we stop and help them? Here is a vision for something that could be better. And this can be sort of like grand, sci-fi inspired visions about space or, hacking our own bodies and making ourselves perfectly healthy. And it can also be, like systemic. Right now, there's a lot of stuff going on about how science is done as an institution, and how papers are published and how grants are funded. And I think the last non-project impetus grants, right? It's basically inspired by FAST grants. But in a nutshell, I got grants when I was in academia, and often it took me like a month to write the grant and then a year to get the money when you're successful. And there's a simple idea of like, what if 90% of that was just bureaucracy and we could do it 10 times faster? And then we tried to do it. Like I said, it was an experiment, but with impetus grants. But then we funded a bunch of stuff and it's getting, published and like getting attention, all the research we funded just as much as if it had been funded much slower. So like, why did that happen? There's, everything has a complex set of reasons and like what happened before it and fast grants and all those things. But partly it happened because somebody, me and the founding donors and then the team that helped, decided like we should try to make this better. And like if nobody had decided to do that, then that wouldn't have happened and the impact wouldn't have happened. And so each of us can just remember that every day in our lives, that like we can change our worlds. Like the choices we make determines how the world looks.
Agreed.
And so far, we've been able to solve most of the things that were definitely going to ruin society, over the last hundreds of years.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say there is, the reason I've remained optimistic is because of people, but not just people like you, Martin. You truly are, not just a great mind scientifically, but you're a visionary as well. And so, the world, needs you, needs you and people like you to kind of take charge, help guide humanity, right? I mean, I think as we just discussed, this is kind of a new wave, a new paradigm that we're trying to usher in the way we do medicine, right? More efficiently, better. And, well-spoken, articulate, brilliant people like you are going to help lead the way. So on that note, Martin, I will say thank you for joining us, and to our audience, thank you so much for listening and taking the time. And until next time, stay tuned for our next installation.
Live long and prosper.
I want to give a special thanks to our guest, Martin Borch Jensen, for coming on HBAN and sharing his valuable insights and what he's doing at Gordian. I hope you found this conversation as enlightening and informative as I did. If you have anyone you would like to see it make an appearance on our podcast, you can send your suggestions to us at info@a4li.org. HBAN will be back in 2 weeks. But until then, let's live long and prosper.